This is hell.
The economic crisis of 2007 and 2008 revealed capitalism for what it is, an illusion. And now that the illusion has been lifted from this debt, shaking our faith in the system, it's time to understand our relationship with debt and a way out of debt permanently. Here to go deep into debt with us, writer Annie McClanahan is author of Dead Pledges, Debt, Crisis, and 21st Century Culture. Welcome to This Is Hell, Annie.
Hi, Chuck. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being on our show. I want to give you a little bit of a warning here at the beginning. Generally for our guests, I write somewhere between 30 and 40 questions, and it might be like 30 or 40 pages of notes. For you, I have 50 pages of notes and 70 questions, and there's no way that we're going to be getting to all of them today. So I just want to tell everybody we're only going to be skimming the surface of Annie's book today because it is really intense and really deep, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. You write, the name for a contract on a real estate loan comes from the French mortgage, which means dead pledge. From this surprising etymology, we might exhume any number of meaningful lessons about the terrifying nature of debt, the strange ontology of property, the uncanniness of ownership, the implicit threat at the heart of the credit contract, casting credit certainty into doubt, reckoning with the problems of unpayable debts, and revealing the hidden violence of the credit economy. Credit crisis culture reminds us that debt is a matter of life and death, not just for individual borrowers, but also for the economy as a whole. If debt, Annie, is a matter of life and death, then why should we put its certainty into doubt? Don't we risk tragedy, self-inflicted destruction by casting any doubt on the certainty and sanctity of debt? Isn't questioning the sanctity of debt dangerous?
That's a great question. Thanks. Well, I think the sense in which it's a matter of life and death is largely because we are increasingly paying for the necessities of life, whether that's housing or health care or food or child care or education. We're increasingly paying for those with debt in ways that we weren't a few decades ago. And so I think to the extent that it is the sort of basis of our ability to survive economically in the contemporary economy, we kind of can't help but throw it into uncertainty because the system as we have it is clearly not working, right? It's been a way to compensate for wage stagnation, but what happened in 2007, 2008 reveals that way of compensating for wage stagnation simply won't work anymore. And that what we have to do in that context is think about other ways to make people's lives livable, increased wages, universal basic income, whatever it is, besides debt, because it's not working as it is, right?
How important, then, is debt, or maybe more precisely credit? I'm not too sure how to disentangle those two things, in the quality of life that we now enjoy? That is, how much would our lives suffer and how much would we have to sacrifice if we didn't have access to debt through credit?
Well, I think for a lot of working and middle-class people, it is the way that they're able to continue to survive given stagnation of wages, like I said, over the last few decades. And I think that's true for the economy as a whole as well. It's the economy depends on the credit relationships that allow us to continue to purchase consumer goods even when our wages are stagnating. The economy depends on that. The economy depends on the ability to defer payment. Corporations depend on the ability to defer payment into the future. But they depend on that payment eventually being made, right? And so for me, one of the ways to start thinking about how to resist capitalism is thinking about how to refuse to make those payments, because that deferral has to come to an end at some point. And if we can find a way collectively to refuse to allow that debt to be paid, then I think that's probably the only way out of capitalism that we have at the moment.
How much is debt and the greater access to credit the cause of our boom and bust, bubble bursting, precarious, seemingly unstable economic area we are living in, dating back maybe to the dot-com NASDAQ bubble of the 1990s, if not earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's absolutely become totally central. And that's really a historical shift. That's one of the shifts that the book is really very much about. It used to be, consumer credit in particular, used to be basically at the margins of the consumer economy or the economy as a whole. It used to be what allowed people to purchase sort of larger luxury goods, automobiles being the best example, but also home appliances, let's say. And it used to be a way to sort of smooth consumption over the course of a borrower's lifetime, right? So that you might have ups and downs a little bit in your income, but you could still have basically the same quality of life by using credit and debt in those sort of small ways. And starting in about the late 1970s, early 1980s, that really changed. And so one of the things that happened, as I said, was that consumers increasingly did not make enough income to pay for the basic necessities of life. They did not make enough income to maintain their standard of living. But the other thing that happened was that capitalists were increasingly looking for new places to invest because manufacturing was starting to stall, profit rates were starting to drop on industrial production, and so they were looking for sort of new domains of investment. And the one that they found was debt, essentially. So that's where you have the creation of increasingly complicated debt securities, where you have speculative financial instruments based on things like mortgage payments or credit card payments. And so it sort of solved for a period these two moments of potential crisis in capitalism, which was inadequate opportunities for investment on the sort of capitalist side and inadequate income on the worker side, right? And so it became increasingly important, and it was central to the expansion of the dot-com bubble, and even more central to the bubble of the 21st century, the housing bubble that happened started after 2001 or thereabouts, where increasingly the federal government was putting into place policies around home ownership and the financing of home ownership that encouraged speculative capital to enter those markets and encouraged people to get larger and larger mortgages, encouraged the creation of subprime lending, which was obviously a huge part of the crisis of 2008. So it's gone from being at the margins of the economy to being at the dead center of the U.S. economy in the last, say, 3 or 4 decades.
Is the price we must pay in the U.S. for continued economic growth debt?
Well, in the economy as it functions today, that's probably true. I don't actually think that that's the only option. And I also don't think that it's working particularly well. I mean, the U.S. economy has not picked up in its growth in the last 5 years after the end of the official recession. So you have a lot of economists now talking about the possibility that we're in a sort of permanently stagnant state where we're not growing at all. So I don't actually think that it's going to continue to work in the way that it did in those decades. And one of the reasons is that it's just become ever more obvious, I think, to borrowers. I mean, I talk about this particularly in the context of student loans. So in the context of the younger people that I teach and work with at the university, I think it's become increasingly obvious to those borrowers how this system works and that they no longer have the same kind of sense of moral obligation to repay. And that sense of moral obligation is built into the ideology of debt and the culture of debt almost since the beginning, well before capitalism. The word debt comes from words like sin and shame. So that's why, for instance, the Christian Lord's Prayer, you have forgive us our debts, right? The debt as a metaphor for sin. In the German, it comes from the word Schuld, for shame. And I think that those kinds of ideologies around debt as a sort of moral obligation are really fading, particularly for young people who really don't know a world where they're not almost born into an impossible amount of debt.
And you write that, quote, you offer a history and an aesthetics of contemporary indebtedness as well as an account of the theoretical and political consequences of debt, how it affects our ideas of personhood and moral character, which you were just discussing when it comes to shame. But what are there political consequences of debt, or are there impacts that debt has on our ideas of personhood and moral character that we do not recognize as being connected to debt? Do we have issues that we're not willing to admit debt has caused that problem within either our moral standing, our personhood, or even our own politics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the things is that, like I said, that debt has always been connected to this sense of shame. And that has worked really well for creditors. That has turned out to be an incredibly effective way to frame it because it is what forces people, for instance, to continue making payments on a house even when they're so-called underwater on it, right? Even when making payments will never get them out of the situation that they're in. And so creditors have really relied on that ideology to convince people to repay debts, even when those debts were, exploitative, or when, in the case of subprime loans, where the person was put into a situation that was sort of impossible from the beginning. They were never going to be able to pay that off, and the creditors knew that, right? And so that ideology has been very effective. And so I think it's sort of the breaking of that assumption that we have a moral obligation to repay that is the site of sort of a lot of possibility. And you could tell that it's a site of possibility because at exactly the moment that more and more people are realizing that that's a pretty bogus assertion, you have people like, say, financial planners, people like Suze Orman, right, saying that debt is like an addiction, saying that debt is a failure of moral character, saying that debt is a failure of will. You have people like Michael Lewis, the journalist that has written a lot about the financial crisis, that wrote The Big Short, comparing debt to obesity and saying that, Americans can't sort of help themselves when faced with a big piece of chocolate cake, and that somehow is a apt analogy for indebtedness. But all of those sort of framings of debt as a failure of will or a failure of moral character assume that people are getting into debt to do things like buy yachts or buy flat screen TVs. When in fact, if you really look at it, as I said, what they're going into debt to buy is housing, food, healthcare, childcare, and education. So that's just one example of how the sort of transformation and retransformation of our ideas around these things really does make a difference both politically and historically.
So what happens when we view debt as something that was a bad decision made by a consumer and not something that they were going after credit because they had to for their survival, that they had no choice but to go toward credit? What do we miss in our understanding of credit and debt when we dismiss the people not being able to pay back their debts as just a bad decision made by a thoughtful agent within capitalism?
Right. Well, I think we miss two things, right? One of the things that we miss, and the thing that we were able to sort of cover over culturally in those decades in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, is we miss the underlying problem of inadequate income and inadequate wages and inadequate levels of employment, right? So when it looks as if the American economy is booming because people are buying lots of houses, we don't see the ways in which that's made possible by this very shaky house of cards, right? Made possible by these mortgages that were sort of unpayable. So I think we miss those underlying factors. But the other thing that I think that we miss is the ways in which people were those loans were marketed and sold as commodities, as consumer goods to people in ways that were intentionally and knowingly exploitative, right? So when you have somebody that, say, actually is eligible for a prime loan from a bank at a decent interest rate, right, and is sold a subprime loan instead, and that happened almost exclusively to African American borrowers. When you have a system like that, if you understand the person's failure to pay off that subprime loan as a failure of moral character, you don't understand the ways in which that failure was built into the system in advance, intentionally, right, in order to extract higher rates of interest and fees from those people. I mean, you can see this almost even more. I don't write in the book very much about the sort of shadow side of all of these things, which is the non-bank sector. But if you look at things like pawn shops, payday loans, check cashing services, all of the ways in which the poor and the sort of unbanked in the United States are bilked every day of billions and billions of dollars just to do basic things like cash a paycheck and go buy groceries, right? If you understand their inability to pay off these absolutely impossible loan agreements as a failure of moral character, then you don't see the exploitation that's going on intentionally in that industry every day.
Do you think that exploitation was done knowingly, or was this an unintended consequence of using debt?
Well, I think in terms of sort of systemic causes rather than individual actors, but I think there's no question that it was systemically intentional. Like I said, you have a system where capitalism is risking and falling into a state of crisis around the 1970s and 1980s because it doesn't have enough sources of profit. And it's very obvious to me that the sort of investor class was looking around for opportunities and saw one. And so I think if you want to go sort of drill down to the level of, individual mortgage brokers or individual bankers or individual speculators in mortgage-backed securities, you're sort of always going to keep going up the ladder till you try to find the most responsible person. But I think systemically, there's no doubt that it was knowing and intentional from the beginning. Yes.
You call credit a fantasy. To what degree is it a fantasy, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, one of the things that language is supposed to get at is the way that credit is a cultural phenomenon, right? So, I mean, one of the things I write about in the book is that it may seem strange for somebody who is teaching in an English department and writing basically about literature, novels, films, poems, art to some extent, to be talking about all these economic issues. But in fact, there's an argument that has been made by a number of scholars working on the 18th and 19th centuries that the emergence of credit instruments, IOU, bills of sale, paper money, right, which is also a debt-backed currency, that the emergence of all of those in the 18th and 19th century happened at the same time as the emergence of another kind of sort of paper fiction, which was the novel, right? And so that one of the things that the novel makes it possible for people to do is imagine that things that they know are not true actually are, right? So in the same way that when we read a novel and we identify with the characters or we feel as if the events that we're reading about are real, that is somehow related to our relationship to, say, an IOU or a piece of paper currency, where we know that that object in and of itself is not valuable, but we treat it as if it is. And so one of the things that I'm trying to get at in calling credit a fantasy is thinking about its relationship to all of these different sort of cultural forms and ways of talking and thinking and dreaming and speaking about debt, and sort of allowing culture to get at something about debt that we might not be as fully aware of in our sort of political discourse.
So can we blame novels on our imagination expanding to the point where we can believe in the debt system that has caused so many problems in our country?
Well, I don't know if we can blame novels per se. I'm probably more of a defender of novels than that. But I think there's no doubt. I mean, cultural forms track economic changes and political changes and vice versa. So I think you could think of it as a sort of symbiotic relationship between the two. But by the same token, right, one of the things that I argue is that when that system comes crashing down in 2007 and 2008, it's actually culture that almost responds to it first. And so one of the things that's really interesting to me is how quickly we have all of these different genres, from the most avant-garde kind of genres like conceptual poetry or installation art, all the way down to the most mass cultural genres like horror film, which I write about in the book, and think about the ways in which that cultural production responded really urgently and transformatively and quickly to these sort of political and economic shifts in ways that I think are actually quite revelatory for us.
Are we in a dictatorship of credit and debt? That is, are credit and debt in unquestioned power over our culture as they function to ensure that their role in our culture stays unchanged, unrivaled, unmatched, and central?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the places that's the most obvious to me is in terms of student debt. So really the sort of inspiration for this book was when I started working with students and talking about their student debt. And one of the things that became obvious to me, I was a graduate student in the University of California system in 2008, 2009, when the university raised tuition quite abruptly by 32% over the course of 1 year. And so I was engaging students in activism and sort of political resistance to that change. And one of the things that became really obvious to me was that the fact that they were paying for their education with student debt really sort of contained and shaped their political responses to it, right? Because for them, even a 32% tuition increase, it was almost sort of meaningless, or they sort of couldn't grasp it because they weren't paying for it anyway. They were deferring that payment anyway. So to them, it was a little bit like, well, what's another $5,000? What's another $10,000? And I think that's actually intentional, right? I think that if you look at the ways that students and young people have been at the center of political movements in the United States, that there's something about the fact of having students pay for their education through debt that makes them feel indebted to the institution. It makes them feel anxious about their economic futures in ways that are likely to encourage them not to resist and not to refuse the system of education that they're in, or the sort of broader context of their education. And that also causes those kinds of changes to it to seem a little bit sort of abstract or something that they don't have to deal with now. So I think that was very much the situation, sort of in the years immediately before the crisis. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is my experience teaching students at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where these students, I think, have a very different relationship to their debt already. They have a very much more of a sort of post-crisis relationship to their debt. And rather than depoliticizing their relationship to the university and to capitalism, I think it's repoliticizing that relationship. I think it's giving them a sense of exactly where they stand in the system and giving them a really kind of canny knowledge of how the system works.
And I want to get into the student aspect of this because I think it's incredibly important for people to understand what's happening on college campuses today, because there seems to be a lot of confusion about it. And what you write about what's happening on college campuses really opened my eyes, despite the fact that I've been talking to a lot of people about what's taking place at colleges. We are speaking with writer Annie McClanahan, who is author of Dead Pledges, Debt Crisis in 21st Century Culture. Annie is an assistant professor of English at the Institute for Research in the Humanities at the University of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. Is the rising cost of education, you're already touching on this, but I want to make sure that people understand this, because so many people think that the reason that the price of the cost of education went up is because the state and the federal government pulled out funds, and then they had to, fulfill that vacuum that had been lost for the resources that they desperately needed. And that was the cause of the rising cost of education. I've even said that on the show plenty of times. Is the rising cost of education due to the same financialization that is at the heart of the housing and economic crisis of 2008?
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And declining state support is certainly part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. There's a scholar in the UC system, Bob Meister, who has really dug into the books on this question in the University of California system. And one of the things that he has noted is that, in fact, it's not the case that higher tuition rates have caused higher levels of student debt. He argues that it's the reverse, that the increased availability of student debt has encouraged universities to continue pushing tuition upward. And one of the reasons for that is that the way that the difference between the role of student tuition in the university's budget and the role of state support in the university's budget is that state support is usually considered restricted. And so you can only use state support, state funding for certain things. So they have to be directly connected to education. Student tuition payments, however, even if they're funded by federal money through the student debt program, student tuition payments can be used for anything. So student tuition payments can be used for big capital projects. They can be used for big real estate development. They can be used to build fancy buildings like a swimming pool. They can be used to pay administrative salaries, right? So the other cause of increased tuition across the public universities in the United States is the incredibly speedy rise of the cost of administrative salaries and the number of administrators that universities are employing, where most universities now employ as many or more administrators as they do faculty, teaching faculty. And none of that would be possible without increased portion of the budget of universities coming directly from students, whether that's in the form of their parents actually paying it or them actually paying it, or that's in the form of them taking out federal or private loans to pay for their tuition. So I think that when we talk about it being exclusively about state support, we're missing at least half of the picture of what's really going on.
So what happens if a tuition bubble bursts?
I think we're getting close to that right now. And one of the reasons that we're getting close to that is the reason that students have been sort of persuaded to continue. I mean, look, tuition has increased 650 times faster than the consumer price index. If other commodities had increased at this rate in the last 20 years, we'd be paying $20 for a gallon of gasoline, right? It's an incredibly unique commodity in our current economy. There's almost nothing like it in terms of the speed of the increase of the cost. And the reason that we've all been persuaded to continue paying that, no matter how high it goes, is because there's this sense that it's the only way to survive in the contemporary economy is to have a college degree, right? And to some extent, that's true, but it's a lot less true than it used to be. So if you look at rates of unemployment for students with a bachelor's degree, if you look at how many people with a bachelor's degree when they graduate are actually working jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree, if you look at the income of people with a college degree, it's actually declining over the last 10 years. And that is a brand new phenomenon. So what economists call the education premium, which is the amount of money that you earn on the basis of having a degree versus not having a degree, that education premium is shrinking. And that's a new thing for the United States economy. And the whole system of the federal student loan program was built on the assumption that rising education levels would correspond to rising incomes and rising employment rates. And that is less true today than ever before. And so I think that we're really on the cusp of this bubble actually bursting because people realize that the sense that it's a sort of investment in your future that you have to make is maybe no longer true. I think we are getting close to that. I mean, I am concerned about what is likely to happen in the for-profit college sector because that's sort of where the worst levels of exploitation are happening. And if you look at the response on Wall Street, the response of that sector to the recent election is that the stock values of those for-profit education companies went through the roof. I think because the assumption is that if we have a president who is himself an investor in the for-profit education sector, that he's not likely to be regulating that sector anytime soon. So I think that's another possible place where we might see the sort of temporary expansion of a bubble and then the bust, because those schools don't provide income or employment outcomes anywhere close to the amount of debt that they get students to take on.
So to what degree is an education a good investment anymore? I mean, I believe that you point out in your book that there are 25% of universities, I think you mentioned, I could be wrong, that 25% of universities actually have a negative education premium. That means that the amount of money you put into your education, you are not going to make up for in increased wages after you get out of college. So, I mean, that's just really frightening to me. So how much is the concern over student debt driven by the fact that these jobs just aren't paying any money and that education just isn't a good investment anymore?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I mean, I think there's sort of two sides of it, right? One of the sides is that the jobs aren't there, or the jobs don't pay enough. And the other is that the amount of student debt that you're taking on to get those jobs is getting higher and higher. So it's sort of getting lower on one end and higher on the other. And that's not to say that look, I'm an employee of a university. I teach students from undergrads to PhDs every day. So obviously I have a certain commitment to the values of a university education. But I think, the sense that we can fully instrumentalize those values, that we can think of the time and the money that we put into gaining an education as an investment, that we can sort of rationalize it, I think those days are probably numbered. And so what I think we have to start thinking about is, how can we transform the way that we pay for these educations? How can we transform the cost of these educations such that they're valuable for students, even if they don't lead to higher income? And so, that 25% of schools where that's the case, those tend to be private schools and for-profit schools. They're not so much the public universities. But you also have a system where public universities, even for in-state tuition, you're looking at, upwards of $12,000 or $15,000 a year. And I actually don't think that that's a continuable or tenable situation for higher education in the United States.
You write, consider a small but revealing act of defacement that took place amid larger campus protests against tuition increases at the University of California, Berkeley in 2010. Lining the campus walkways at the time were promotional posters from the university advertising department emblazoned with the words, "Thanks to Berkeley," and filled in with a variety of motivational, enthusiastic student testimonials. One such poster, though, carried a different message. "Thanks to Berkeley," one protester scribbled onto the sign, "I'm in debt forever." Then even the word Berkeley was crossed out and replaced with the word capitalism, providing an even more insightful account of the contemporary credit economy. "Thanks to capitalism, I'm in debt forever." One might choose to read this clever bit of graffiti as a kind of individual complaint or solitary confession. Yet in the context of the broader campus activism that was its occasion, it stands as one of several examples of a collective movement aimed at putting university life at the center of economic resistance. How much is debt at the center of campus activism today? And can we better understand what is happening on today's college campuses with activism when we consider it as a form of economic resistance, not one of education?
Yeah, so I think one of the most sort of effective aspects of the turn of college activism towards debt is that it allows student activists to start to see their interests as aligned with those in the working class and those without a college education, those in the middle class, because debt is a shared condition, right? It is probably the defining feature of American economic life today. And I think that one of the things that it makes possible is, we've been talking a lot in the wake of the election about all of these divisions, right, between college educated and not, between middle class or professional workers and working class folks. And I think that one of the things that debt allows us to do is to stop seeing those as divisions, right, to see that the common experience of being in a sort of having an unpayable level of debt and having that debt track you for your entire life, that is an increasingly shared experience. And so one of the things that I was really inspired by in the sort of UC system in that period immediately after the crisis was the ways that student protesters also got involved in anti-foreclosure protests and helping people to try to keep their houses, helping people try to prevent evictions. And so when students can see their interests as aligned with people with mortgages who can't pay them, or people with credit card debt who can't pay it, or people who are being exploited by pawn shops or payday lenders, then I think that's where you get the basis for a real political movement that isn't just on the campuses, isn't just about sort of cultural protests or countercultural protests, but really is a movement about economic injustice.
So what happens to a culture, in your opinion, when education, which has been commodified, is no longer a good investment?
Well, I think it forces us, like I said, to rethink what we mean by education and why we're going to get it. And so, I mean, I'm often faced with the question of how to talk to undergrads who are thinking about graduate school, and knowing that graduate school in the humanities is ever less likely to produce the kinds of jobs that it used to produce, and ever more likely to have the student end up in debt. And so one of the things that I tell students when they're, sort of weighing these options is I say, first of all, try really, really hard not to go to graduate school unless you're going to do it without debt or without very much debt. Try to find a school that will help pay for your tuition, that will help give you some kind of stipend, help pay for your health insurance, et cetera. But also understand the reasons why you're doing it. And if graduate school is appealing to you because you want to move to a new place and meet new people and continue studying, then great, go for it. It's an amazing way to spend 10 years of your life or 8 years of your life. If you think it's going to lead to a job and that's the reason why you're doing it, then you should rethink your decision. So I think it really has to do with, as I said, rethinking why we go to universities, what we can do in universities, how we can make universities transformative politically and personally in different ways, other than assuming that that experience is going to inevitably lead to a good paying upper middle class job.
You're right, because the amount of consumer lending across all these sectors, mortgages, credit cards, student loans, far outpaced their economic gains, especially wages, between the 1980s and the early 2000s. Default on all these risky loans eventually became widespread. When it did, the interconnectedness of credit markets, once seen as a model for the interdependence of the social order, threatened to destroy the economy. How much do you think that social interdependence being overturned by the 2007-2008 economic crisis, how much was that reflected in this recent presidential election?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you look at the sort of populist anger about anything connected to Wall Street, there is no doubt in my mind that that's a product of the crisis, right? That's the moment at which people realized I am expected to continue making payments on my house even if I owe more than the house is worth. I'm expected to continue making payments on my loan even if somebody gave me a adjustable rate mortgage that was going to balloon to a payment that I couldn't possibly afford. And yet the banker that gave me that loan, or the institution that securitized that loan, or the investor who invested in that loan, or the investor who invested in a credit default swap on that loan, none of those people are going to be expected to repay, right, their obligations. None of those people are going to be held accountable for what they did to make the system fall apart the way that it did. I think that moment, right, where debtors realized that they were responsible and they were being held accountable and their creditors were not, that's the moment when the system starts to sort of crack and fall apart, because that's the moment when that is.
Are you still there?
This kind of,
oh,
yeah.
It was breaking up a little bit. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. That's the moment when this understanding of debt is this kind of moral relationship and the sense of sort of mutual obligation, that falls apart right at that moment. And I think that has really been what has driven anger about the economic system over the last sort of 7 or 8 years since the crisis. And so I think that's been decisive in sort of changing the rhetoric around our relationship, the relationship between what we used to call sort of Wall Street and Main Street. So I think it's been tremendously important.
So there's now there's more profit to be made by investors if they invest in financial markets than if they invest in manufacturing, and that's driving deindustrialization. So is it possible to, as Donald Trump has been promising, bring the jobs back to America that went overseas when the investments are, investors are making investments in the financial markets and not manufacturing? In other words, can those jobs come back without the reining in of financialization?
No, they definitely can't. I think there's other obstacles to it as well, right? Which is that these companies that have become accustomed to sort of making their profitability has become dependent on an incredibly low cost of labor, whether that's through automation or whether that's through outsourcing or whether that's through moving factories to other countries where there's where wages are lower. So I think those jobs are not coming back for a series of reasons, and financialization is definitely part of it. I mean, financialization is what makes it possible for a company to decide to move a factory to another country, right? Because typically the investment in that new factory, the investment in that move is made possible by credit. And so as long as it's easy for them to get credit for these for moving companies outside the United States, for changing their production lines to largely automation rather than labor, as long as that's possible, there's no way of changing the system. And also, if you look at the people that Trump has already put on his cabinet, it is decidedly a Wall Street oriented cabinet thus far. So I actually don't think that despite the rhetoric around, say, the carrier plant, bringing some of the jobs from the carrier plant back, I don't think that there's any sense that this administration is going to change that situation.
You write that one way to view the contemporary crisis is as yet another in the series of repeating, intensifying shakeouts that have characterized capitalism since its inception. The most influential account of this view appears in Giovanni Arrighi's The Long 20th Century, which describes a recurrent pattern in capitalism between epochs of material expansion and phases of financial expansion. Arrighi argues that each of these phases corresponded to a different imperial power as each hegemon enters its final stage of financialization. It comes into crisis and is forced to cede control of the global economy to a new rising hegemon. From the 17th to the mid-20th century, Italian rule gave way to Dutch to British, finally British to U.S. As Arrighi's account suggests, the current crisis is that a crisis not only in financial markets and the global economy, but also in U.S. hegemony. Are we now seeing a global hegemon, the U.S., ceding power to a new rising hegemon? And if so, what nation, in your opinion, is that new rising hegemon?
Well, that's a great question, and that's one of the things that the book is really interested in exploring. It's also something I'm exploring in my new work. The argument typically has been that new rising hegemon is China or possibly the sort of Pacific countries generally. So you have, for instance, Clinton and Obama making the sort of pivot to Asia in the second term of Obama's administration. And I think you have the real sense that if there is a rising power in the global economy, it probably is China. But I actually think that what's been happening in the last few years has suggested that that's not the case, right? That whereas, as I say in the book, each of these previous cycles from the 16th century up through the late 20th century, each of these cycles have been, there's been a situation where at the fall of one global economic superpower, there's been another one ready to take on the global economy and to drive growth. And if you look at, sort of declining Chinese economic growth over the last few years, it doesn't appear as if China is remotely prepared to fuel the entire global economy on its own. It just doesn't seem like that's a possibility. So I think one of the things that I argue in the book is that we have in the current moment a crisis that's actually not like those past crises, that sort of breaks the pattern because there is no new global superpower to take the reins of capitalism. And in that sort of vacuum of political and economic power, I think is also the cause of a lot of the sort of political uncertainty today. And particularly if you look at things like the breakup of the European Union, you can see the ways in which these institutions that people thought really were going to be the next sort of source of global economic dynamism are themselves failing. And so I actually think we are in a very new moment in terms of the history of capitalism.
How much has credit allowed us to mask the real deep economic problems of the United States? Because you quote historian Louis Hyman writing, "In the face of uncertainty and declining wages, Americans indebted themselves to maintain the life they had once been able to afford." So how much has credit clouded our understanding of the economic problems in the U.S.?
Oh, it absolutely has. I mean, I think that there's really no doubt about that. And you can also think of it in terms of the ways that it sort of works out on racial lines, right? So that, as I said, for instance, before, that you have African Americans much more likely to end up in subprime loans, right? And so increased rates of African American home ownership, which, by the way, was a policy platform of George W. Bush in his first term. He wanted to increase ownership rates among African American households. If you look at how that was paid for and the damage that it did in the long term, it becomes very clear that racial inequality in the United States is if anything, worse than it was at the end of the 20th century, let's say. You could also look at the fact that in the wake of the crisis of 2008, African American households lost every cent of the wealth accumulation that they had made in the wealth gains they had made since the civil rights movement. And so one of the things that this sort of failure of the credit economy reveals are the continued effects and consequences of economic racism and institutional racism, and the ways that has sort of impacted the lives, particularly of people of color in the United States. And so, again, part of what I'm interested in is thinking about debt as this sort of thing that crosses classes and crosses races and makes possible new sort of political and economic solidarities across those lines.
With debt, then, do we live in a world of unfounded optimism that we must believe in, that we must have faith in, or the whole economy will crash?
I think we certainly used to be in a situation of optimism. I think now we're largely in a situation of fear. And so one of the things that's one of the things that I write about. It's one of the things that I'm interested in calling the book Dead Pledges and talking about this sort of horror fear that is behind the very word mortgage. And so I think what used to be a situation of optimism and hope and assuming that our economic situation would always improve such that we can repay our debts has become a situation of fear and anxiety. And you can see that even in the ways that loan collection works, whereas loan collection used to work basically by drawing on that language of moral obligation. If you don't pay your loans, you're a bad person. They've actually, in the last decade, gone back to the kinds of techniques that they used in the 19th century, even to the extent of having what are essentially debtors' prisons, where people end up in jail for not paying debt. And I think if you look at the ways that credit collection has gotten increasingly more violent, you see the ways in which what used to be this sort of language of hope for the future has become a sort of feeling of fear for the future.
You write that the crisis that began in the 1970s and came to full manifest expression in 2008 is a different kind of crisis from those that heralded the ends of the Italian, Dutch, and British financial empires. In this crisis, there is neither a new rising hegemon to take the reins of power, as you were just saying, nor an imminent resolution available with the current regime of capital accumulation. Winter is coming, but not spring. So what is winter, then, in an economic sense?
Well, I think winter is a situation where not only is it the case that people are not able to pay their debts, but where that inability to pay debts starts to really wreak havoc on the system as a whole. And I think that you actually can see the sort of looming effects of that and the reason that, to me, that sort of language of winter and of no growth or no life, you can see that in the way that the U.S. economy has stagnated. So you can see that in the fact that the Federal Reserve still doesn't feel safe raising interest rates at all because growth continues to be really low. You have, unemployment rates. If you look at the sort of bigger picture of unemployment rates continuing to be high, you have wages continuing to stagnate. They even fell this quarter. And so I think in that situation, you do not have a vibrant economy. You do not have an economy that's able to sort of power global capitalism on its own, essentially. And if you also look at what's happening is that housing prices are back up in a lot of parts of the country, particularly where I live in California, are back up to where they were in 2007. And so you have the possibility that even in a context of basically zero national economic growth, you also have a bubble looming, whether that's the higher education bubble or another housing bubble. And so I don't actually see this as a resolvable problem in the way that it was resolved in the past, where you have a new innovation in capitalism, a new kind of transformative form of production, whether that's, the factory or the assembly line or technology, microelectronic revolution. I don't think that you see something new like that on the horizon. And I think in that context, we're about to enter a period of total economic stagnation globally as well as nationally.
So green energy infrastructure investment, you don't think that would solve the problem?
I think it's possible that could have solved the problem temporarily if that had happened a couple decades ago. Given the current rates of debt in the global economy and given the sort of the structure of the global economy as it stands today, it seems unlikely to me. There would have to be a lot of political will towards making sure that happens, and there does not seem to be any of that political will at the moment. Certainly, it wasn't reflected in either of the two candidates for office in this particular election, and certainly not in the Trump's policy positions. So no, I actually don't. I think it's unlikely that is going to be a driver. I mean, because moving to more sustainable modes of energy would require a contraction of capitalism. It would require that we spend more and make less and use less. And so I think at this stage, it's kind of unlikely I think it's unlikely that will happen, but I also think it's unlikely that would resolve the problem that we're in today.
We have been speaking with Annie McClanahan. She is author of Dead Pledges, Debt, Crisis, and 21st Century Culture. She's an assistant professor of English at the Institute for Research in the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And as I said at the beginning of this interview, I had 70 questions for you. I think I got to half of them, and we didn't touch on a lot of the book. Just so our listeners know, this is really an intense book, Dead Pledges, Debt, Crisis, and 21st Century Culture, and it will even make you reconsider your views on property. It really is an amazing book, and people should read it. One last question for you, Annie, and it's our question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, our audience is going to hate your response. In Resistance, you suggest sabotage and destruction against debt. Why are sabotage and destruction, in your opinion, the appropriate political response to debt?
I think one of the reasons is because if we think about the other forms of political resistance that have typically characterized economic movements or movements for economic justice, let's say strikes as the sort of primary one, those are not the tools for resistance for the present, both because what you have is a situation where fewer people are in unionized work, fewer people are employed, period, and you have this sort of possibility for solidarity between students and workers that I think would not be sort of captured by the strike form. And so I think in that situation we have to go back to a technique like sabotage, which is an older technique. It's not new. It's part of early resistance to industrial work in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so I think we're in a moment where we have to sort of look back on those older forms and think about what possibilities they offer for the present and the future. And
your book is really important for people to read, especially on days like today when the front page headline of the New York Times is Obama's gift to successor, the economy, jobless rate falls, but money feel passed by. Well, that's because if you read Annie's book, there are fewer and fewer people working. The jobless rate may drop, but that's such a misleading number. It's just like the Dow Jones and NASDAQ being used to determine if the economy is doing well for everybody. Very misleading numbers. So we need information like that is involved with your book. And so I really appreciate you being on our show today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell, and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.
Let's take a quick look at what Alex has been up to on social media. Alex, you